introduce Craig Frayne, which is Palabra Technical communication, technical Palabra Technical, which is in Germany. He's in Germany, but I think he's American, so it's multilingual, multicultural. And Craig is a freelance technical communicator, and he does also design. He's an API technical writer at the moment for the scaling e-commerce platform at About You in Hamburg. So thank you very much for joining us. And Craig, you have the floor now. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to try to turn my video on here as well. Great. And you can see my presentation, right? Good. I just want to confirm because sometimes with a Mac on Zoom, I have problems.
Yes, I know, but it's okay. Perfect.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for the invitation. I've really enjoyed listening to the other presenters, and I can relate to a lot of the comments I'm hearing about getting feedback from SMEs and editing and so on. So it's really good to hear that others have the same experiences. I want to zoom out a little bit and look at the big picture. And that's why I'm talking about aesthetics. That was the term that I thought best fit for what I was thinking. It's a little bit more than UI, UX. I know that often people will think, well, that's just UI, UX, right? But back on the theme of wearing many hats, it's about linguistic style and a lot of things. Yeah, so Palabra is just, that's my personal website, so you're welcome to go to that. But today I will be talking mostly about work I'm doing with Scale in Hamburg. So let's first just talk about what are we thinking of with aesthetics. I think we all know this word, but I think of it as a branch of philosophy. It has to do with beauty and taste, as well as the philosophy of art. That examines aesthetic values, judgments of taste. So that's obviously very general, very big picture, but I love it for that reason, because sometimes we need terms and concepts to grasp the holistic view of what we're doing here. It's usually associated with art, right? So art, music, writing, fashion, cultural artifacts. I'm a little bit tongue-in-cheek when I say documentation, because documentation might not be on the same level as those others, but in all seriousness, I think we can give ourselves a pat on the back and think about the complexity of what we're doing sometimes, and the artifacts that we're making, and the intellectual effort that goes into those by a lot of different people, a lot of very smart people working on these technologies, and we're bringing it all together into a packaged form. So although I'm being a little bit tongue-in-cheek and self-deprecating and saying documentation is not at the level of art, I think if I bring in all the people I've worked with and colleagues and the technology I've worked on, I would say it is. And we're facilitating that process, right? So it is a cultural artifact. I like to think of it as that. So why am I thinking of aesthetics with technical communication? So this goes into a case study. So it's less than a year I've been working with Scale in Hamburg. So I began as a technical writer with them last year. Scale is a software as a service solution that emerged from About You in 2021, so very recent. About You is one of Europe's biggest online fashion retailers. And what they did was they took their e-commerce platform, so what they use in their back end, and they sell it as a B2B service to other businesses as a SaaS product. Scale is very fast growing. We had 100 million euro last year in contract volume. The documentation consists of API reference manuals for developers, as well as user manuals for the panel interface, which is like a storefront admin interface that shop managers would use to manage their online stores. The technical documentation had not received the focus that it might if the company were starting from scratch as a startup. It was always kind of a side project within this company because it was part of a parent company and they weren't publicly released as a Scale product. So that created some challenges coming into the organization with the level of users and the customers and the expectations for what this would be and where it was at in terms of the attention it had had. And being the only technical writer, I think I've heard from some others that they are in that situation as well. It creates its own unique challenges. So why aesthetics? When I joined, I had quality on my mind, and quality is the theme of this conference. I had quality on my mind when I joined, but it wasn't the type of feedback that I thought was responsive to, okay, I'm going to go back to customers and get feedback on quality and do quality improvements. It was often quite nebulous. So it was things like people just didn't like it. They can't tell you why. A sense that quality improvements need to be made before we even go and get formal feedback. Something's just not right. And that can be frustrating, but then that's maybe when you need to take a step back and think big picture, think of maybe the aesthetic qualities. So I'm talking about more than UX UI, although that's a big part of it, and I'll show examples in a few seconds. But sentence structure, so I think some presentations earlier talked about accessibility in text. Also, when you're dealing with software, the types of code samples you're using, when you're using code and how often. Is the code elegant? Is it, what end users want? And it can't be too complicated as well, right? Things like typography, layout. And also what I want to stress and what I'll finish with in this presentation is the internal attitudes and perceptions around the technical writing team and the documentation in the organization. I think that's part of the whole package. And there's maybe some, I'd like to hear from others on that as well, but there's maybe some strategies we can use to set some guidelines and keep our standards high in terms of what we're doing and how people are perceiving us. So I will go into UI improvements. I think that's the most obvious theme here when we're talking about aesthetics. So the resource center, that's what I manage. It's a docs as code web app. It's run as a development pipeline. It used like an out-of-the-box web app called Dimer.js. I don't think it is maintained anymore, but they basically took the web app and just put their own content into it as a boilerplate. I remember when I started working with this last year, I was working in the platform. I started getting a feeling of unease and discomfort when I was working in it. So I think that was due to some UI things. It seemed, when I look back now, it's a bit bland. The color contrast wasn't quite right. The spacing wasn't quite right. It was an app developed by developers to do development documentation. It wasn't an app developed by UI experts. That's my impression. And the main thing I think here was when you look at, this is the landing page for the resource center. It's not really bringing out the fact that this is a tech organization that's an API first e-commerce system. Most of the people at this organization are developers and they take that seriously. And they want to profile that in their company image, right? And that didn't really stand out in this. So some simple changes. It looks a lot different, but it's relatively simple without changing the whole web app. So I didn't redesign the whole app that is in the cards, but that's not what I'm doing at the moment. But just bringing out the API documentation first, putting it more front and center, putting code examples front and center. I added a getting started guide, so it creates a bit more coherence to the whole thing. So there's about 7 or 8 guides in the whole resource center, but it was never obvious where do you start. And just giving a little bit more structure and space to the whole thing, obviously increasing some color contrast as well. Same thing in terms of the actual text layout. When I was working in this, it just seemed a little bit too bright, maybe crowded. I'm not a UI UX expert, by the way, so some of you may have better terms for this. And I didn't have access to UI UX people internally for whatever reason. I'm not sure why, but so talking about the many hats we wear, it's just judgments that I had to make as a technical writer. But I thought colors were applied in the wrong cases. This is an example where they took the style guide and maybe applied it too literally. So applying the style guide text font to the headers maybe wasn't the best idea in terms of accessibility as well as just usability. So things like increasing the spacing, increasing color contrast, Yeah, applying fonts, increasing sections, spacing between sections. They weren't major things, but they looked major when you contrast that and that, right? So those were some examples of UI improvements. Also text, I consider that as part of the whole package. The text flow, obviously that's the main thing as a technical writer. And what I got the sense of was the actual text that I came into wasn't actually bad. It was actually pretty good. Content-wise, it was quite good. It was very detailed, maybe a little bit too detailed. But just the spacing and the density of it didn't seem quite right for how people are using this app. So the average time someone uses this is about 1.5 minutes based on analytics. So that tells me that people are going on and finding what they need on one page and then getting out. So this is just an example of some changes to the text that I made. So more descriptive top line headers. So if you land on a page, instead of just saying overview, it's a product data overview, being a little bit more descriptive as to exactly what it is on that page. But then the second level headers, more punchy and to the point, data quality and structure. That's what it's about. And then cutting down that second level heading you see there. And then obviously the pulling out bullet lists, more highlighting text, bolding the main ideas. Again, nothing that's new to people probably in this call, but just some things that were not changing. I wasn't changing that much text content. If anything, I was removing a lot of detail. Yeah, similar here. So just removing some redundancy. So the scale panel allows you to centrally manage multiple shop and language translations. By the time someone gets on this page, they will know that, right? They're working with the product. They already know it does translations. That's why it's on this page. Telling them again that the panel has this translations feature isn't really what they're expecting. It's just kind of distraction on a technical documentation page. So just pulling that sentence out, making everything a little bit more brief. So typography and style. So we have a nice style guide that was already in the organization that the marketing team was actually using. So making some decisions as to where and when you're going to apply that style guide. So making it consistent, but not overdoing it. So I think there was a tendency to just blankly apply or blindly apply the style guide to the documentation, but it's not marketing documentation, so it doesn't quite work that way. So maybe sneaking in some of these colors, but these colors don't necessarily work for your main documentation, right? But making them a little bit subtle in where you're using them. Also with the fonts, I did make a decision that these fonts were okay for readability, but if there's a font expert, they could maybe correct me on that. But these were the fonts that were in the style guide, and I did decide that they're okay for documentation. This one here, not so much, but for some headers, it was okay, I thought. The marketing content for this organization is really cool. It does the job really well, I feel. It's pretty in your face and flashy compared to what technical documentation and API documentation would be. So again, making that design break from what the other content people in the organization are doing is a decision that had to be made, right? So this is my favorite topic, a little bit more personal experiences, and maybe we can share some reflections after the presentation on this. A part of the whole package I felt is establishing respectful interactions. And please don't take this as a commentary on the current organization I'm working for. I want to stress that this is my third software startup. So I did my PhD in applied linguistics and discourse analysis, and that was my interest. I fell into software several years ago. I'm now on my third software startup, and you start to notice some patterns in this industry after a while. But these are probably things that are common to all industries. A lot of them are just human nature, I feel. As a technical writer, you're probably not going to be the most prestigious. You're not in the most prestigious role in the organization, especially in tech. That's why I like it. That's why I chose it. I think that's great. You can kind of be in the background. It can be a very good thing, a nice way to work, but it can also lead into, it's a fine line, right? You can sometimes be second fiddle, or maybe seen as a little less than. So you are maybe a little bit less than the developers, right? Or the SMEs. So establishing some strategies to assert your expertise, because you do have expertise, and developing that standard, right? I think it's been very important for me in these tech organizations, because it can be a challenge, especially I find in tech, people get pigeonholed as you're technical and you're non-technical. It's either black or white. It's not quite how it works in my mind. People have fragmented knowledge. Even the experts have fragmented knowledge. They're piecing together pieces to meet various challenges. No one knows everything. And the non-experts sometimes don't get enough credit for what they do know. And I'm always on the alert when the technical writers and my colleagues get labeled as the non-technical people. Sometimes I need some strategies, and I remind them that, well, depends, right? So bringing up examples of past things you've worked on, if you have some experience, or if you're a student, you've probably worked on some sophisticated projects, right? And just subtly bringing in examples of what you've done, problems you've solved. And it raises the whole discourse around technical writing in the company, I find. And the feedback might not always be constructive. So strategies for dealing with that. So setting parameters around the feedback and funneling it in the right way. So yeah, when people are to make JIRA tickets, what they do when they make a JIRA ticket. If they have a comment, here's what they do. Establish those guidelines and Confluence or whatever your internal processes are, what the communication protocols are. And that way you can set up a bit of a barrier, because I find documentation can be a bit of an emotional, because you're showcasing what the technology is, right? And if people aren't happy with it, then and everyone, a lot of people feel that it can be easily done. So comments like, it could be a lot quicker, or why isn't it, that could take 5 minutes, that kind of thing. All fine. I mean, it's all fair, but establishing some of those communication protocols just to make that kind of discourse go in the right direction. And redirecting the focus to customer end users. So you often get the most feedback from internal people, and the people who are deep into the product. To be honest, they're not the ones who you're writing for most of the time, at least in my experience. So redirecting those discussions back to, well, I wonder what the end users think about this, or I wonder how we could get their perspective on that, right? And I find that usually takes some of the more critical discussions in the right direction. And as I mentioned, making feedback easy and accessible. I think the presentation this morning was good, giving that overview. So I won't go into that too much. That's why I developed the process for everyone in my company uses Google Docs. So making it seamless to allow everyone to comment on using Google Docs on all the content without me having to go in and cut and paste all the time and do that. So I developed just an automation tool to enable that process. Yeah, so just some next steps for what we are working on here. So rebuilding the Docs as Code application is something hopefully I'll be doing this year. Going through the user journey. So I think some of the examples I showed you were just very low hanging fruit, like just improving the basic UI and the basic flow. But now it's going in more to the user's shoes and getting more step-by-step. What are they doing and where are they running into some pain points? And developing more complete code examples at every stage. Hopefully some video tutorials. In software, that can be hard because the product changes very fast. And good videos take a long time. So You could easily develop a video that's out of date in 2 months and you've wasted a lot of time, but we will think about that. And getting formalized user feedback. So I'd be interested to hear other examples from others, but the idea I have is post-project surveys and interviews. So send out a survey after a project. So a developer implements one of these projects, get their feedback in survey form, qualitative and quantitative, and then give them the option of booking an interview for a more qualitative interview, conversational feedback as part of that. But there might be other options there. I'd be interested to hear other perspectives. So that is about the time. Yeah, there's my contact. I'm interested in hearing from you. I'm also interested in keeping up academic collaboration. So if there's any researchers and people feel that there might be some overlap in what I'm doing with research topics, please feel free to reach out. And you'll see on my website, there's also examples of articles in the research fields I've worked on as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Craig. You fostered many, many comments on the comment, on the discussion, and everybody, a lot of people reacted to what you said. And when you said technical writer are not the most prestigious role, and Stuart said, what a disappointment. And Laurence said, it's often true. But Lubna gave a very, very good definition, and Marie and I, we love that definition. The most technical of the non-technical role. This is about technical communicators.
Yeah, I like that too.
Yes, it's a very, very good comment. Also, we have a comment about on Carly, of course. So I let you read the comment Carly did, and maybe Danielle wants to say something.
Yes, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Kind of.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh.
Je pense essayer puis.
Okay. If you can hear me, let me know. Thank you so much for this presentation, Craig. It was wonderful. I have so many things that I want to share. I'll try to keep it brief. I think the most important thing that I provide some feedback. I think that as technical writers, one of the core competencies that we don't talk about enough is emotional intelligence. And we can actually say that for any career, but really as a technical writer, you need to
yes,
be able to...
Sorry, Danielle, for interrupting you. It's not very clear what you say. Maybe Tanguy can help you to be clearer.
How about now?
Yes, better.
Is that better?
Yes, much better.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I apologize, first of all, for the sound. We're all in a meeting room, and so we're jumping back and forth between audio sources. So yes, I wanted to thank you for your presentation, and I was just saying how I really feel like emotional intelligence is something, a requirement, I think, for technical writers, in a way to be able to kind of deal with that sometimes unconstructive, unhelpful feedback, or how we manage stressful situations, how we manage relationships, communication between other people. We say it's not a technical role, it's a very human role, and it's one of the most important parts of what we do. And it really is something that should be taught in terms of, I think, this to go along with being a technical writer. And then to respond to what user feedbacks, things like that. Within Dassault System, we have used Google Analytics on our user assistance portal to see how long people are staying on a given topic, which one do the most. We also conducted a survey that had maybe less than motivated feedback. I can certainly sympathize that it's hard to get feedback from our end users. And we were also scrambling to find, so when the Google Analytics dashboard came along, we were very, very thankful for that. But there's always a way to try to push further, and I'd be certainly interested to hear anybody else in terms of user feedback, what you guys have implemented and seen. That would be great.
Thank you very much, Danielle. Have you got any answer, Craig, to Danielle?
Yeah, I mean, no answer. Just the emotional intelligence part, I think, is underrated in this role, and you have to have the whole package, I think, to do this job well. And yeah, I mean, it's an ongoing thing. I'm trying to develop strategies to assert that role of technical writers in the organization, right? That's how I put it. So whether it's effective or not, I think it's too early for me. I'm taking a new strategy in the current organization I'm with. My previous role, I was in digital publishing, which was a different set of, a bit different than core tech, right? But yeah, it's a challenge, but it's part of the job as well. So yeah.
Thank you. Fanny did ask interesting questions about interview and qualitative feedback also. Have you got anything to answer to that, Craig? She said, when assessing the impact of a change in the content or doc aesthetics, I found that its simplified analytics-based assessment are hard to use. For example, what does it mean if a page is viewed a lot? Is the content useful, or is the feature too complex?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I have, even in my academic research, I was always skeptical sometimes of overly quantitative approaches and analytical approaches. I'm really one who favors how do people feel about it in general, and then try to make interpretations based on that. I know that's not as specific as people in a business audience might want, but one of my favorite research topics when I was doing PhD research was body language, and how cognition is encoded in body language. And I think that's something I'd really like to delve into in this role as well, is getting user feedback, doing something like interviews and trying to interpret what is unsaid, because people won't always tell you directly they don't like it or it's not working. Or I think a lot of developers don't even use documentation. They go on Stack Overflow and just search for stuff, and they just ignore the docs. So I think there's maybe a different approach we need to getting feedback that's a bit more honest.
There's two interesting questions also from Lubna, which is an instructor in our curricula also. And is your work on the website there accessible publicly?
I forgot to mention that. It's not at the moment. It's password protected, so it's accessible by customers. That has to do with the history and when the company wasn't public until, well, it's not public. It's part of the larger company still, but it didn't get released as an entity until later last year. So hopefully this year it can be, but for academic purposes, I'd probably be able to just give you access if you were doing some kind of study on it or something like that.
Thank you very much for Lubna. And last question, in your opinion, what should be the first thing to look for in order to improve the UI?
How people feel when they're working with it. I know it's nebulous, but I had a stress reaction when I started working with the documentation. I didn't know why. I didn't know it was a UI thing, but I couldn't work for more than half an hour within the web app. The colors weren't right. The contrast wasn't right. I think a good UI expert would know that, right? But I didn't have that knowledge. So I think people's gut reactions as they're working in it.
And a very nice comment, I'd like to read it from François Violette, one of our instructor also. And you have a lot of feedback in the, you can read.
Great. Yeah, please get in touch if you want to follow up on anything.
Yes, please. Are you an expert in video?
No.
No. Okay.
I've done it, but I'm not not an expert.
Okay.
In anything. I'm not an expert
just,
in anything, really.
No, I know. Nobody is an expert on anything. I'm looking for. In fact, I'm looking for one-day course for L3 Pro on video. Just a simple, very simple. Back to down to earth teaching about how to do a video. So if you feel like doing that for just one day, let me know. Sorry for interfering. Thanks. And giving you some, well, hoping that this floor will answer my question. So I let you read all the nice feedback that you have in the chat. Craig, thank you very much for your presentation. It was very refreshing, and you also, and thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Now we come